So, what is baptism? What does the word baptism mean? You may think you know, and you may be right. But in the church world today, a lot of confusion has been sown about baptism. I remember a few years back, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I was in a chat room that I had joined for ministers of the Word, and it was an interdenominational chat room, and I was in there just posting my weekly sermons was all. And I'd been in there a few weeks and had fielded some questions and so on. I hadn't actually said anything about baptism in any of my lessons, but the moderator of the site wrote to me and demanded to know if I thought that baptism was necessary for salvation. When I answered in the affirmative, I was kicked out of that room because they were persuaded that baptism is an outward sign of an inward work. And they weren't going to tolerate someone being there who was teaching that baptism is necessary for salvation. There's been a lot of confusion sown by those who want to undermine the practice of baptism to create doubt about what baptism accomplishes by creating doubt about what baptism is and what the word baptism means. Because if they hollow out the word, emptying of its actual meaning, then they can fill it up with any meaning they choose to give it. How many times have you heard someone say that baptism is an outward sign of an inward change, or an outward symbol of an inner grace, or a manifest declaration of one's faith, or of one's salvation? And if you listen to an apologist who doesn't believe that baptism is an instrumental means of salvation, most of them will start their argument by sowing doubt about what the Bible says about baptism, by calling into question the meaning of the word baptism itself. That's the starting place. That's the foundation upon which they build their arguments. They start by trying to convince you that the word baptism is actually devoid of meaning, and therefore it can't mean what you think it means because it doesn't really mean anything. And the reason why it has no meaning is because the English word baptism isn't actually a word. Prior to the translation of the King James Version, they'll tell you, there was no such word in the English language as the word baptism, and not having a word for it, Lancelot Andrewes and his colleagues simply transliterated the word baptisma, creating the English word baptism. But beloved, that is utter nonsense. And my purpose today is to give you the true history of the word baptism and the true depth and the riches and of its meaning and usage. And I want to do this in service of 2 Timothy 2:15, where Paul says, "Study tenaciously, that you may present yourself as one qualified to represent God, a skilled artisan having no cause for shame, rightly discerning the word of truth." Because I want you to be prepared to give an answer for those who ask why you believe that baptism is necessary for salvation. I want to begin with a few passages from the Old Testament, and these may surprise you a little bit. Exodus 12:21 through 22. "Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and baptize it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel of the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin." Leviticus 4:16 through 17. "Then the anointed priest shall bring some of the blood of the bull into the tent of meeting, And the priest shall baptize his finger in the blood, and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil. Leviticus 9, 8 through 9. So Aaron drew near to the altar, and killed the calf of the sin offering, which was for himself. And the sons of Aaron presented the blood to him, and he baptized his finger in the blood, and put it on the horns of the altar, and poured out the blood at the base of the altar. Leviticus 11:32. Anything on which the body of an unclean animal falls shall be unclean, whether it is an article of wood, or a garment, or a skin, or a sack, any article that is used for any purpose. It must be baptized in water, and it shall be unclean until evening. Then it shall be clean. Leviticus 14:5 through 6. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop, and baptize them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. 2 Kings 5:13 through 14. But Naaman's servant came near and said to him, My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? He has actually said to you, Wash and be clean. So he went down and baptized himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Now, all of these passages come to us not from the Hebrew Old Testament, but from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible commissioned by Ptolemy II in the 3rd century BC and completed 132 years before the birth of Christ. And all of the occurrences of the word to baptize in the readings I just presented you were supplied not by me, but by the Septuagint, which contains within it a number of uses of the word bapto, which means to dip into, or to immerse. And as you know, the Bible that was commonly read in the synagogues in Roman-occupied Palestine was the Septuagint. This was the Bible that Jesus read from in the synagogue. And consequently, by the time of Jesus' baptism, the Jews were very familiar with baptism as a rite of purification. And because of the passages that I just read to you, they associated water baptism with the blood of the Passover, with the forgiveness of sins, with healing, and with the overcoming of the corruption of death. So when John the Baptist came along and began baptizing people for the forgiveness of sins, he was not doing something completely novel. Because the Jews of 1st century Palestine were familiar with baptism and already understood it as a means of purification, and a powerful means at that. Because as they understood baptism, it had protective power, exculpatory power, curative power, and the power to at least address death and keep it from encroaching on the lives of God's chosen people. And this is vitally important for apprehending today's lesson, they knew this rite by the same name that we know it by: baptism. And this is important because understanding that gives us the opportunity to clear up a misapprehension under which I, and I know many others, have operated for years. Because I had been taught by a number of scholars, even a number of preachers, even a number of conservative scholars, that the English word baptism was coined by Bible translators as a feeble response to an intractable problem. And this is a pervasive point of view among even conservative Bible scholars. Indeed, an entire narrative has been built around what's largely a myth. But the narrative is false. See, the narrative goes, the Greek word bapto and its cognates baptize, baptismos, baptisma, and baptizo, or somewhat obscure, and were used in a wide variety of ways prior to the writing of the New Testament. And because of this, there's a great deal of uncertainty about how to translate these words, so the translators of the King James Version simply cut the Gordian knot by supplying the authorized version of the Bible with a transliteration of baptisma, rather than with a bona fide English word. Rather than dealing with the question, they instead coined a new English word, baptism, and left the question for future generations to hash out. Consequently, as the narrative goes, there's never been a proper English word for baptism because no one could ever agree on a word, so they settled for the transliteration, baptism, which isn't a proper translation because it isn't even a word. It's a faux word, a made-up word, a substitute word for an actual English word. Now, I suppose that many of you have heard that or something very much like that. But, beloved, it simply isn't true. The reason why those who translate the Bible into the common tongue do so is for common understanding. Translators do what they do in an effort to clear things up, to disambiguate the text, not to muddy the waters. And English translators, as a class, have never equivocated when it comes to translating the word baptisma and its cognates. Never. And I can say that with authority, going all the way back to the origins of the English language. In 360 AD, the scholars who translated the Gothic Bible had a clear point of view on baptism, and they consistently translated baptisma with one form or another of the Gothic word dipon. And you can see this in the bulletins. If you have a bulletin with you, you can see an excerpt from Luke 3:7 there, which I won't try to read to you because it wouldn't make any sense to you, but you can see the word highlighted. Now, Gothic obviously isn't English as we know it, but it is the forerunner of Anglo-Saxon, from which the English language sprang. So Gothic is a sort of proto-English. And in the Gothic Bible, baptisma and its cognates are consistently translated with various forms of the word dipon or gedipon, which is to dip, to immerge, to baptize, or to immerse. And these words correspond both with the Old High German, taufi, daufen, and defa, which means to baptize, to dive, to debut, to make an entry, to name, to unveil, or to launch, all of which relate to one aspect or another of baptism. And both the Gothic and the Old High German here are contemporary with Latin, which was the international trade language of the 4th century, and in that same time frame was becoming the language of the church. And these words for baptism, chosen by the Gothic and German translators who rendered these translations, correspond directly both in time and in lexical meaning to the Latin word baptizare, which means to immerse, to immerge, or to plunge into. And interestingly, even though only a few fragments of the Gothic Old Testament have survived, the lexical entries for the word dipon include references not just to New Testament baptism, but also to some of the Old Testament passages that I read to you earlier. Exodus 12:22 and Leviticus 4:17 and Psalm 68:25. Well then, 600 years later, in the Anglo-Saxon Bible, also known as the Wessex Gospel, we find that every instance of the Greek word baptisma and its cognates is translated with some form of the Anglo-Saxon word fulligena, whether it be gefullian, fulwillian, gefulwitan, or some other form of the word. And again, you can see examples that I provided for you of Matthew 28:19, Mark 16:16, Luke 3:7, and John 1:26 through 27. And this is quite interesting because while the lexical definition of all these words starts with to baptize, various forms of the word convey various secondary meanings, all of which speak to one aspect or another of baptism. For instance, fulgerian means to complete, to finish, to equip fully. Fulwian or gefulwitan means to make as white as fuller, to sanctify or to consecrate. And gefullian means to full baptize, indicating immersion, to be brought to completion or to perfect. And these words are all contemporary with the Old French baptisier, which means to be baptized or to give a name to. And that brings us to the transition into Old English, and closer to the point that I want to make with this part of today's lesson, because by the 14th century, English began to become more recognizable to us, such that the Wycliffe Bible, though difficult to read, is readable once you become accustomed to the unusual spellings of the words and some of the more obscure vocabulary. Now, the Wycliffe Bible isn't as consistent on this question as the Anglo-Saxon Bible was, which preceded it by 400 years, or the Tyndale Bible, which came 200 years later. Because though Wycliffe renders the Greek word baptismo and its cognates with the English word baptism most of the time, he sometimes uses the word christening, as you can see again by the example that I provided for you in your bulletins. However, even this is more consistent than you might think, because while in modern English the word christen conveys the sense of to sprinkle, in Old English, christenion literally meant to make Christian, and also conveyed the sense of to name. But by the 16th century, Tyndale made the translational choice of consistently using the word baptism to render the word baptisma, as you can see in the example that I provided to you from Matthew 28:19. Now, why do you suppose that he chose to use the word baptism? Well, it wasn't, I don't think, because he was hesitant to commit to any one English word for fear of repercussions for taking a point of view on what baptism is. No, every Bible translator has a theological point of view, and I haven't met one yet who is shy or apologetic about it when it comes to the work that they produce. And any translator who denies that his work is influenced by his own theology is lying, either to you or to himself, and he isn't to be trusted. So no, I don't think Tyndale was motivated by fear or indecision. Rather, I'm persuaded that the reason why he chose the English word baptism to translate the Greek word baptisma is because it was precisely the best word to communicate the depth and breadth of what baptism is. And his aim was to communicate the Bible precisely to the English reader, to the English reader, the English speaker, in the common tongue. And choosing the word baptism was part of that effort. You see, during the lifetime of Tyndale, the English language was in a state of comparatively rapid change, because the European landscape was in a state of comparatively rapid change. And at the time when he published his Bible, Latin was on its way out as the international trade language of the European continent, and French was on its way in. And no language was having a greater impact on the evolution of English than French was having. And the English vocabulary was quickly being populated by borrowed words from French. And as I mentioned earlier, the Old French had the centuries-long established word baptisia, which was adopted into the English language as baptism at the beginning of the 14th century. And as such, this may be one of the reasons why Wycliffe was inconsistent about using the word baptism in his translation, because it was a new word in his lifetime. And not knowing the future, he had no way of knowing whether the French influence on the English language was just a trend, or if it had staying power. But by the time Tyndale was translating his Bible, the word baptism was well established in the English vocabulary. And this word had the benefit of being received as the direct etymological descendant of the Greek word baptisma. Because the English baptism comes from the French baptême, which comes from the Old French baptisier, which comes from the Latin baptismus, which comes from the Greek baptisma. And unlike many other words, when it comes to this word, the definition and more importantly the usage has remained stable throughout all these transitions, remarkably. For 2,000 years across 3 continents, across 5 languages, and across countless cultures, the meaning and usage of the word baptism has not changed. In its biblical context, the English word baptism means exactly what the Greek word baptisma meant. And accordingly, the way that this word is used in the church now ought to correspond with the way that it was used in the church then. And that's what I want to dedicate the remainder of my time to this morning. What the word baptism meant to the biblical authors who received it as a full-grown word and then used it in writing the New Testament. I want to start with the word bapto, which is the root word or stem word upon which other permutations are built. The word, if you want to look it up yourself in Strong's Dictionary or online source, is G911. Anyone who wants to do their own homework. And it means to dip or to bathe. But the dipping or bathing that's in view is not in water, but in a refiner's fire. And it refers to red hot iron in the process of being tempered, or it means to patinate, as coral becoming hardened over time. And this, I think, affirms baptism as a starting point for the Christian life, a beginning point from which God refines us day by day. As it says in Proverbs 17:3, the crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. And again in 1 Peter 1:7, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it be tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Second, the word bapto refers to slaughter in Greek tragedy. And in that context, it's used of those who are slain as martyrs for their cause. And this, as I understand it, affirms the fact that in baptism we present our bodies to the Lord as living sacrifices. As Paul says in Romans 12:1, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, for this is your spiritual worship. And as he says of himself in 2 Timothy 4:6-7, for my life is already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Third, bapto means to dye in the sense of to change the tincture of fabric or to alter the color of one's hair. And this for me brings to mind the image of a dyed-in-the-wool Christian and sheds light on passages like Revelation 7:13-14, where it says, Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, Who are these, clothed in white robes? And from where have they come? I said to him, Sir, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Fourth, bapto means to glaze or to gild. And this speaks to the fact that when we undergo baptism, we are tabernacled, body and spirit, in grace. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:7-9, so to keep me from being too elated by the surpassing greatness of these revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to beat me down, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, and he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may be tabernacled upon me. And fifth, the word bapto is used to speak of the drawing of water by dipping into a vessel, or by dipping a vessel into water. And this brings to mind John 12:32, where Jesus says, And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people unto me. Because the word draw in that passage doesn't mean that Jesus will attract people to himself, or that he will beckon them. What it refers to is drawing of the sort that is done when water is drawn from a well. And this speaks not only to divine election, but also to the fact that in baptism we surrender ourselves to death, and the Lord raises us up from the watery grave to life. And that raising up from the watery grave is prefigured, for instance, in Psalm 18:14-17, where the psalmist declares, He fired off a spray of arrows, shafts of lightning, strafing a broad swath. Then with a single breath of his nostrils, Yahweh suspired a sough of reproof, exposing the ocean floor, laying the foundations of the earth bare. Then reaching down from on high, he retrieved me, and purchasing me from the watery deep, he rescued me from the clutches of my enemies. After all, death is the final enemy to be defeated. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes it clear that the instrumental means by which we receive the grace which equips us to overcome death is baptism. Next comes the word baptizo. This word is Strong's number G907, if you want to look it up. And it means to dip repeatedly, to immerse, to cleanse by dipping or submerging, to wash, to make clean with water, to wash oneself, or to bathe. And this brings to mind Hebrews 10:19-22, where it says, Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts purified from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Second, baptizo means to overwhelm, to submerge as of a vessel sinking, to drown, or to get into deep water as one who is over head and ears in debt. And this harkens back to the trial of the refiner's fire, and is evocative of the fact that in baptism we receive the Holy Spirit of Jesus Christ, which plunges us into a world in which the most intimate of things can be communicated in groanings which are too deep for words. And though the presence of the Spirit of Christ living within us can be overwhelming, this same reality equips us to take on circumstances that would otherwise overwhelm us. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, 6 through 11, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts, to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, to show this all-surpassing power is from God, and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our bodies. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal bodies." And finally comes the word baptisma, which is Strong's number G908. Now, there are two other cognates, but everything that I would say about them would be redundant. But the word baptisma is the word that I want to end with here. Now, just as with baptizo, the word baptisma likewise refers to immersion, submersion, and to calamities and afflictions with which one is quite overwhelmed. However, in addition, this is the word most often used in the New Testament to refer to John's baptism and to Christian baptism. And this, to my mind, closes the loop on all these lexical definitions, because what I've done this morning is to demonstrate complete, unbroken continuity between the English word baptism and the Greek word baptisma. Christian baptism is what it always was. And the word baptism means what it has always meant. The major translators in the history of the English Bible never copped out by using the word baptism. That was never a dodge. That was never a circumvention. No, they chose that word specifically because of its profound solidarity with the Greek word baptisma, and because of the rich history of translation embedded in that word through its etymology in French, Old English, Anglo-Saxon, Gothic, Old High German, Latin, and Greek. Because all of the things affirmed of baptism through the ways that baptisma and its cognates have been translated over the course of its English heritage over the last 2,000 years actually arise from that original Greek word family. And that's why the word baptism is the perfect English word to use, both linguistically and experientially, because the Bapto word family is rich in meaning precisely because baptism is rich in substance. Baptism is dipon, daupion, gedipon, to immerse, to emerge, or to plunge into. Baptism is tauft, daufen, defa, to dive into, to make an entry, to name, to launch. Baptism is fulligena, gefilian, fulwillian, gefolwitten, to complete, to finish, to equip fully, to make as white as fuller, to sanctify, to consecrate, to be brought to completion, to perfect. Baptism is baptisie, to give a name to. Baptism is Christian, to make Christian, to name. Baptism is bapto, to bathe, to temper in fire, to patinate as coral becoming hardened over time, to be slain, to be conquered, to dye as in to change the tincture of fabric, to glaze, to gild, to be drawn as water is drawn from a well. Baptism is baptizo, to immerse, to wash, to make clean with water, to overwhelm, to submerge, to drown, to get into deep water. Baptism is baptisma, to be immersed, to be submerged, to be overwhelmed. Beloved, the word baptism and the reality of baptism together make up the foundation upon which the apostles' understanding of baptism was built. And if you ever hear anybody try to claim that the word baptism in the New Testament is a void, that the church over the centuries filled up with doctrine, which doctrine is nothing but dogma, run fast and run far, because that person is foisting a peruke of artificial boscage. Now, what I have done this morning is to begin to lay a foundation down for us in order to prepare us for the lessons in the weeks to come, in which I plan to explore what baptism meant to the apostles, not just by definition, but by their experience and reality of baptism. And that's where we'll pick up next week. That's my lesson for today.